The Better Together Project is really fundamentally a question about identity and a question about belonging. Identity and belonging. The effort of the Better Together Project is to help congregations engage in a center set posture, a center set versus a bounded set posture. One of the ways that this language, center set and bounded set, and that may be new to some of you, maybe you're familiar with it, made its way into the church world was by way of someone who, by a guy named Paul Hebert. He was a missionary who was serving in India. He was a career-long missionary. He ended up teaching at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And he came to this center set versus bounded set vocabulary. It emerges really out of social theory and out of mathematics. Now, I'm no mathematician, so I'm not going to try and even, walk that road. But he brought in this center set, bounded set thinking out of his own mission work in India. He would have the experience where he would work with a Muslim or a Hindu man there in India. This individual would come to a saving faith in Jesus. They would confess with their mouth and believe in their heart. And yet, what Paul experienced was that oftentimes he would then be invited to their home at a later date, and this individual would have there in the corner a little shrine, a little space of kind of traditional worship there in the home. And Paul really didn't know what to do with that, right? Here was an individual who had expressed faith in Jesus, and yet they have this kind of little temple of sorts there just in the corner tucked in their home, and he didn't know how to interpret that. Were they a Christian or were they not? Were they saved or were they not? And what he realized is that he had fallen into a very bounded set posture, a way in which identity and belonging are determined in reference to a boundary that has been set. One of the more helpful illustrations for me in thinking about bounded and centered sets, beyond that kind of origin story for Paul, comes out of farming and ranching. Now, I am no farmer, I'm no rancher, I am an urban city pastor, but I have a friend who grew up on a multi-thousand acre ranch in Oklahoma. And he tells me that this works. So and let me be clear, this is not my illustration. I'm parroting this from other places. But imagine with me that you have a large tract of land and you have some cattle. And you need to be able to make sure that your cattle stay your cattle and they don't blend in with the neighbor's cattle and they don't go too far afield. One of the common ways to keep cattle close is to build a really good fence. You construct this fence that stretches across the boundaries of your land. It keeps the cattle in, it keeps other cattle out. But one of the challenges with fencing, right, is that it's labor intensive, it's time intensive, it's costly to maintain, but it does provide a great sense of clarity. You know whose cattle are whose. The cattle inside are yours, the cattle outside are not. And the reality is that those cattle, their identity and their belonging are determined by their relationship to that fence. They're inside, they're yours. They're outside, they're not. And one of the challenges that we experience in the church is too often our identities and our senses of belonging are determined by the boundaries that we create. In the world of ranching, there's an alternative to building fences, and it is to drill a really good well. One of the realities, if you have a large tract of land, is that cows realize quite quickly where they can find sustenance, where their thirst can be quenched, where they can find, and this preaches, living water. And the challenge then is to drill a really good well and to supply these cows with fresh water in such a way that they do not stray from the well. You don't need to build the greatest fence because they're not going to walk away from that life source. And in this situation, their identity and their belonging have more to do with their orientation toward and their proximity to the well. And one of the opportunities that the Better Together Project is offering is to help congregations move away from gaining their identity and their belonging in reference to a fence that's been built, and instead invite congregations to cooperate across their differences while gaining their identity and belonging from the well of living water, from Christ at our center. But we have these social issues, these challenges that often divide us, and we gain our identities from that dividing line, from that boundary that's created. And we gain our sense of belonging to community, to connection, to the church, in reference to that boundary. And that can often cloud over the identity and the sense of belonging we get from our orientation to and our proximity with the well of living water. And so the Better Together Project is an opportunity for congregations to step into or deeper into, maybe you say, well, my congregation kind of understands that center set thinking. Maybe we haven't articulated it that way, but it's an opportunity to step deeper into that. And one of the challenges, of course, when we start talking about center set thinking is in Christ at that center is how are you defining that Christ? Who is the Jesus to which we are being drawn to and invited to drink deeply from? And for us in the Better Together Project, we're saying it's the Christ that we find in the Gospels. It's the Christ who's defined by the creeds. And it's the Christ who is, and this is important, informed by the Reformed confessions. This is not a highly confessional effort. I just need to lay that out there. This is an informed by the creeds effort. And so rather than looking at our creeds, informed by our confessions, defined by our creeds, informed by our confessions. And so the confessions, rather than functioning as boundaries that one must cross or be on one side or the other, we're really trying to look at our confessions more as guideposts, as signs, as wayfinders that help direct us in a particular direction. And so for those of us in the Reformed faith, we look at things like the Heidelberg Catechism, we look at things like the Canons of Dort, we look at things like the Belgic Confession, or Our World Belongs to God, or the Belhar, as signposts that if we follow along in this way, we think that ultimately you'll be being drawn closer and closer to the well of living water, Christ, who is at our center. But it's informed by, it's not a defined by posture. So that hopefully can provide a little bit of a context for what we mean when we're talking about centered versus bounded thinking, bounded set thinking.